Wow, well, it just goes to show you can't believe everything you read on flyers. You have 10 seconds to think about what you... I want to start by saying something that, people here may not agree with, but I think that we have to think through the issue carefully of testing, which is that tests, and even standardized tests, by themselves, I don't believe are inherently evil. Of course, I'm sure you're not surprised to learn that I think the way they're being currently used, or misused rather, is tremendously evil and tremendously damaging to teaching and learning. But I think it's important to understand that what standardized tests really are, and that they are, as a tool of measurement, profoundly and extremely limited. This is not measuring length or width with a ruler. You're measuring a person. Not only are you measuring a person, you're measuring a person's learning process. This is a very, very difficult thing to get a handle on. And to try to assign a number to it is just a profoundly complicated and difficult task. And so anyone who attempts to do it and tells you that they've got it figured out is either a huckster or a liar. I mean, they're selling you snake oil. There's just no question about it. And so we have to talk about standardized tests, what use they might have, and then the way they're actually being used and what it's really all about. I was reminded of this when I was thinking about ways that I've seen my students really learn over the years. For the past 9 years, I've been an elementary school teacher in Harlem and last year in Brooklyn. And I remember last year I was teaching 4th grade in Brooklyn, and we had this thing where we were talking about how to add fractions. One of my students was convinced that when you're adding fractions that have different denominators, the number at the bottom, that you can add those denominators together. Of course you can. You're adding. And I decided I wasn't going to say anything about that. I was just going to let the other students comment, and of course a debate ensued. Now look, I'm going to tell you, I'm not going to lie to you. I did what I was not supposed to do. We got off pace, people, because I allowed my students to debate this particular point for 2 days. This particular boy, it was quite hard as a teacher to watch this happen, because this particular boy is very persuasive. At one point, he won over near the whole class. I was like, good Lord, come on, somebody help me out here. Argue the other side, please. But, it shifted back and forth, and people would have examples and counter-examples. And then this year, I had the privilege to begin a doctoral program in urban education. I started learning about the social science and meeting social scientists who would say very humble things like, I've been laboring with a misconception about the connection between the labor market and the underlying economy, and everything I've written for the past 20 years has been wrong. It's like, wow, we allow professional social scientists to sit with misconceptions for 20 years, but we will not allow an 8-year-old to sit with a misconception for 20 seconds in a classroom. The learning process is not linear. It's not just, I say this, now you know it, take the test. The learning process is circuitous. It wanders, it rambles. You look out the window, and then sometimes it goes out the window, and it comes back years later. My 3rd grade teacher tried to drill into me how to use a comma. Now, personally, I think I'm quite good at using commas because of her. But it didn't stick in 3rd grade. Probably didn't even land in my brain until about 7th grade when I said, oh, that's what she meant about using commas. But God forbid that she had been judged on how I used commas in the 3rd grade when it had not stuck with me yet. So we have to understand that this whole thing of setting down a standardized test, saying this is what you know, and this is a fair way to measure you, to measure your teacher and measure your school, is an extremely misconceived enterprise. The standardized tests are extremely poorly understood. And I actually misunderstood that sign, because I thought that sign meant what NCLB promised. What No Child Left Behind promised was that by doing all of this standardized testing, we're going to expose racism. We're going to expose the way students have been neglected and underserved in our public schools. I think people then interpret this sign to mean, people here, that the misuse of standardized testing that's going on right now is exposing racism. I didn't interpret it that way. That's why I didn't go there. But they promised to parents, to Black and Latino parents, to parents who have students with special needs, they promised them, we're going to apply heat to the schools. The schools are going to have to answer for how your child is doing. They said that by showing these test scores, that's gonna bring help on the way. That any place where the scores are low, then help is gonna rush over to that place. Now let me tell you, if that's the way it really worked, then I would say we all need to turn around and be the champions of high-stakes standardized testing. If standardized testing meant that a place that was underserved was suddenly going to get deluged with resources and actual help and support, then we should support standardized testing. But we've had more than a decade of it, and that has not been the pattern. Instead, it's an educational Hunger Games. It's which school's going to live and which school's going to die. Who's going to advance and who's going to be held back. It's the opposite. It's who's going to get punished and who's going to get rewarded. So that's why we have to understand the promise that NCLB and high-stakes standardized testing held out, and why its promises landed on people's ears for the right reasons, but why it has not actually delivered on those promises. In New York City, they grade the schools on a curve. They say ahead of time, 25% of all the schools in New York City are going to get a C. No matter how much they improve, no matter how much the scores go up, no matter what the school report card is, we're going to take them all, and 25% of them are going to be rated C every year. We're just giving the parents information about the schools so they can make choices. Except there's a curve, parents. And 7% of them are going to get a D every single year, and 3% of them are going to get an F every single year. Now, if you or I did that in the classroom, we'd be run out as teachers, and rightly so, for saying that 3% of our students we know ahead of time are going to fail, and 7% are going to get a D. Ahead of time, we set that out as teachers, we would be considered doing educational misjustice to people, and that would be right. So we have to understand what this testing is really about. Tests are extremely limited. Another thing I think we have to say about standardized tests is that they are a cultural product. They are not a scientifically objective yardstick. They are a product that reflects the dominant culture at a particular moment in history. And that means the people who have, in this point in their life, done the most to assimilate the dominant culture and the dominant outlook in society are always going to do better. And people who, for whatever reason, because of language, culture, background, ethnicity, socioeconomics, are not part of that dominant in-group, are always going to have a harder time on those tests, seeing everything the way that the dominant people who designed the test see things. And that's why socioeconomics, race, class, family background are always the most consistent predictors of success on standardized tests. They have a thing called the National Assessment of Educational Progress. It's a random test. You can't prepare for it. You don't know you're going to take it. They never identify who takes it, which students or which teachers, not attached to individuals. So it actually is superior. And this is what I mean about understanding standardized tests in a more sophisticated way, because even with their limitations, sure, giving out a kind of randomized test to just get a general sense of what's going on, that might tell you something that's worthwhile. But that would be an actual use of tests that's appropriate to their limitations. But once you start attaching stakes for individual students and individual teachers and saying that your success or failure in life is going to be evaluated based on this limited instrument, then you're talking about something else. Then you're just totally laying waste to any kind of authentic teaching and learning. And I think we have to come to see that this is not, we have to speak carefully about the misuses of standardized tests, the specific ways it's damaging teaching and learning. But I believe we now have to come to a point of understanding that these standardized tests are not actually about teaching and learning, that they are not being misapplied, that they are being perfectly applied for their actual use, which is not about teaching and learning. What is their actual use? I believe their actual use, for which they are perfectly designed, for which they are the perfect instrument, is the privatization of public education as we've come to know it. The data from these tests is like blood coursing through the body of privatization, feeding all of its various organs. The data from these tests feeds the testing companies, for which we must increasingly, it doesn't matter how many homeless children we have or how large the class sizes swell, there's no money for that, but there's millions to design more and more tests. Millions for data analysts, millions for data security to make sure that there's no, that's the solution to the cheating problems, of course, is to spend millions more on armed guards standing around while 8-year-olds take the test. Of course, that's the solution. We can't lower class sizes and hire another teacher, but we can put somebody there to guard the testing process. The data feeds their bottom line, there's no question about it. And then if you're smart and you're taking the Pearson test, well then you're obliged to buy the Pearson test preparation product. The Pearson curriculum. I mean, you're an idiot not to, because they're the ones who are going to tell you how to pass the test. The data from these tests feeds the attack on unions. It disrupts solidarity and is designed to prove that public school educators, especially unionized teachers, are failures. The data feeds privatization because it supports the failure of, or the labeling of large numbers of schools as failures, closing them down. It creates an ideological cover for the project of closing them down and replacing them with non-union, partially privatized, or in some cases fully privatized charter schools. And lastly, I just want to leave you with this idea, which is that I believe that the data also feeds the ideology of this system that we're living under. It feeds the idea of individual merit. It feeds the idea that when you go out in life, you better now, while you're 8 years old, get accustomed to the idea that good things are going to flow to you if you keep your numbers up, and bad things are going to flow to you if your numbers go down. If you, 8-year-old, don't learn how to produce, and you find yourself left back, or you find yourself with a different teacher next year because your teacher was fired, or your school closed down, you find yourself dislocated, well then you only have yourself to blame because we gave you a test. And it was fair. We gave the same test to everybody, you see. And so it takes all of the attention away from the system and the resources and all of the inequalities that have been well documented and that we've been fighting and protesting for decades. And it puts all of the ideology of the responsibility for the outcomes in education on the students, on the families, and on the human beings who are working with them. And I believe, lastly, just one last thing, that this is also a power play. There was a teacher over here who said, well, I know how my students are doing because I spend every day with them, for 180 however many days. But this is about saying we cannot trust that human to tell us about these humans that they're meeting with every day, because we can't possibly ask that person whether or not the kids are ready to go to we couldn't do that. We have to have some way, sitting maybe 3,000 miles away looking at a laptop computer, to tell whether or not those kids are ready. I have a friend who's a music teacher in Harlem who was brought in by the Department of Education last summer to help them develop a music test for elementary school kids.
Oh my God.
Because how are you going to know whether or not she's a good music teacher? I mean, really. You cannot, God forbid you should listen to the kids play guitar. God forbid you should have to listen to the choir sing. The only way to know is to give them a pre-test when they show up, and give them a post-test when they're done, factor in her value added to them, and put it on a spreadsheet. That's the only way. That's the only fair way to judge her as a teacher. So we understand that this is about taking the power away from the people who are close to the teaching and learning, and putting all the power far away from the actual site where the teaching and learning takes place, and putting the power about judging, evaluating, making decisions, deciding what's going to be a priority, what's not going to be a priority, what's going to be taught, what's not going to be taught, who's going to advance and who's going to fail. All of those decisions being moved away from the site of teaching and learning. And we should protest the way they're taking power away from teachers, but we should also protest that means taking power away from learners to direct their own learning process. Thank you.